Now, what about Soviet Jewry? One of the great alibis for the mass murder of Jews in the 20th century has been the glib statement that the Jews had it coming to them because they supported Bolshevism. They instigated the Russian Revolution. They supported the communists. That alibi explained in part the actions, or so the perpetrators thought, of the mass killings in Ukraine in the Civil War, the massacre at Yidvabne, the massacre of Lithuanian Jewry in the summer and fall of 1941. But what are the facts? The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 happened because of the support of Russian soldiers, Russian workers, not because of Jewish support. The only gauge of Jewish political sentiment that we have in 1917 are the elections to the Constituent Assembly, which took place in November 1917. 2% of the Jews voted for the Bolsheviks, as opposed to 25% of the Russians. So much then for Jewish instigation of the Bolshevik Revolution. However, as I said, when the Civil War began, as tens of thousands of Jews were murdered by the Ukrainians and by the white armies, who was the only source of protection? The Red Army. The organizer of the Red Army was Trotsky, who was Jewish. His original name was Bronstein. And there is a joke going around among Jews that the Trotskys make the revolution and the Bronsteins pay for it. But at any rate, the Red Army also had pogroms. The difference was that anybody engaged in a pogrom in the Red Army would be executed. Lenin issued a strict order, no pogroms in the Red Army. And as anti-Jewish violence ramped up, more and more Jews not only saw the Red Army as their only savior, but actively joined the Red Army to get revenge and to fight back. And then by the time the Civil War was over in 1921, and Russia was a basket case, remember, the wars had begun in 1914. Millions and millions of people had been killed. Add a little bit of typhus, the epidemic, add a little bit of a famine, 1 million here, 1 million there, and we're talking about a massive disaster that overtook Russia. And in 1921, when the fighting finally ended, the Bolsheviks looked around and they governed a country that was flat on its feet. Now, Lenin and Stalin, as I said before, had denied before World War I, in their arguments with the Bund, Lenin and Stalin had denied that Jews were a people. They don't have a territory of their own. They don't have a language of their own. Yiddish, it's a mishmash. They're a caste. Lenin very jeeringly talked about the Minsk, Vilna fatherland that the Bund seems to want to hold on to. Plekhanov called Bundists Zionists who were afraid of getting seasick. There was a contemptuous attitude towards Jewish nationalism. But the fact was, pragmatically, that you had 2.5 million Jews, most of whom were Yiddish speaking, some of whom could be of great use to the Soviet Union. And so without really altering their ideology, the Soviet leadership now adopted a new policy towards Soviet Jewry, concentrated still mainly in Belarus and in Ukraine, which was to support Yiddish schools, support Yiddish theater, to support Yiddish culture as long as it was pro-Soviet. Now, there's a little wrinkle to all this. Well, there are two wrinkles. Wrinkle number one, Lenin himself really didn't have this burning desire to root out Hebrew. He hated Zionism, of course, but he hated Bundism too, and he destroyed the Bund. They were forced to join the Communist Party. But Lenin didn't care about Habima or about other examples of Hebrew culture. But now Jewish communists, many of whom had been Bundists, demanded that all Hebrew teaching be closed down, all religious Jewish education be shut down. And many of these former Bundists, now turned communists, joined a group, part of the Communist Party, called the Yevsektia. The Yevsektia was short for the Jewish section of the Communist Party. And the Yevsektia was tasked with undertaking Soviet communist work on the Jewish street. Now, the Yevsektia pushed very hard for Yiddish schools, Yiddish theater, Yiddish literature, and in the 1920s, the Soviet Union turns into the only country in the world where the state is supporting Yiddish culture, where in Belarus you have courts which use Yiddish, where Yiddish is an official language, where Yiddish is on the signs of the Minsk railroad station, and Yiddish writers like Peretz Merkish and David Bergelson and Moshe Kulbacher returning to the Soviet Union because they say, if you want to be a Yiddish writer, this is the only place to be. Now, the Yevsektia's efforts were supported by the Ukrainian and Belarusian communists in the 1920s, because the Belarusian and Ukrainian communists wanted to build up a Ukrainian and Belarusian culture. Especially in Belarusia, the majority of the urban population was Jewish. What did the Belarusian communists not want Jewish parents to do? Send their kids to Russian schools. They didn't want the cities to become Russian-speaking. They wanted to further this weak Belarusian culture. The Ukrainians wanted to develop Ukrainian culture. They didn't, and they knew that in both cases, when the Jews opted for a prestigious non-Jewish culture, they'd opt for Russian. So that meant that the Ukrainian and Belarusian communists worked together with the Yevsektia to kind of force Jewish parents to send their kids to Yiddish schools. Now, what were these Yiddish schools like? Well, on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, it meant that Jewish kids were studying with other Jewish kids. It meant that Jewish kids were, in a certain way, immersed in a Jewish atmosphere. They were Yiddish speakers. So in many cases, a Jewish kid in Minsk in the mid-1930s would still be a more fluent speaker of Yiddish than he would be of any other language. So that was a powerful obstacle to assimilation. On the other hand, what was these Yiddish schools like? Well, for Passover, they might decide to have a mandatory school dinner with a lot of bread. On Yom Kippur, they'd be extremely zealous in taking attendance and making sure that everybody had lunch. That kind of thing. They went out of their way to mock Jewish tradition. And of course, Jewish religious teaching, Zionist teaching, Hebrew teaching was severely persecuted, even though there was an underground religious movement. Chabad especially distinguished itself here. There were underground Zionist organizations. But Jewish life in the Soviet Union was encouraged, it was supported. as long as it was Yiddish. And to be fair, the Yiddish theater was extremely good, especially in the 1920s. Yiddish poetry reached unprecedented heights. But clearly, much of what we call Jewish culture was not allowed. In 1928, the Soviet Union embarked on a new course of industrialization, the 5-year plans and the collectivization. And that opened a new chapter in the history of Soviet Jewry. A number of things happened. Number one, keep in mind that a large proportion of the old Russian middle class and the old Russian nobility, the former doctors, lawyers, engineers, the Russians who could read and write and who had university educations, a lot of them had been killed or left the country. As the Soviet Union now moved into an era of industrialization, the Jews were a group that stood out for literacy and education. And now Soviet Jewish youth ran into the universities, ran into the technical schools, left the cities of the Pale for Moscow and Leningrad, became scientists, engineers, became managers in this expanding Soviet industry. And this resulted in an incredible social revolution on the Jewish street. It also meant that now the socio-economic and cultural character of Soviet Jewry was beginning to change. Jews living in Moscow or Leningrad didn't go to Jewish schools. They now began to speak Russian more and more, and you began to have more and more intermarriages. Most Jews were still living in Ukraine and Belarus, but the processes of higher education were already very clear. I'm going to give you a statistic which still kind of blows my mind. That by 1955, Soviet Jewry was about 1% of the Soviet population after the losses of the Holocaust and so on. 1% of the Soviet population. But if you looked at the numbers of Soviet citizens with a higher education, in absolute numbers, the Jews were in second place, only to the Russians and ahead of the Ukrainians. It was only in 1955 that Jews dropped down to third place. 1% of the population, but second only to the Russians in higher education. Another way of putting this is that if you look at Jewish communities around the world, proportionally, Soviet Jewry was the most highly educated, occupying a very critical niche in the Soviet system. By the late 1930s, a kind of unwritten social contract was emerging between the Soviet state and the Jews. Stalin began to get rid of Jews in prominent political places. He began to close down the Yiddish schools. On the other hand, Soviet Jewry was told, you will get opportunity, your kids will get a great education, and just keep your mouth shut. And many Soviet Jews seemed to accept that bargain. One other point. In 1928, the Soviet Union began an experiment. They proclaimed that Birobidzhan, an area on the Chinese-Soviet border, would become a Jewish autonomous region. And Jews were encouraged to settle there. And the hope was that in time, Birobidzhan would become a Jewish Soviet republic, with Yiddish as the language, with the universities and medical schools and theater. And many American Jews hailed this as a wonderful thing. Many Jewish communists even asked permission to settle there. But the Birobidzhan experiment was undermined by the mass arrests that took place in 1936 and 1937. So it never really played a critically important role in Soviet Jewish life. On the eve of World War II, Soviet Jewry had lost much of its Jewish energy, much of its cultural energy. Ukrainian and Belarusian Jewry was still predominantly Yiddish speaking. It was the Holocaust that really destroyed those parts of the Soviet Jewish population. But on the other hand, Soviet Jewry in Leningrad and Moscow was well on its way to taking its place as a pillar of the scientific and managerial elite of the country.